Yeah. So, let me show you this. So I want to look at the idea of rights. I think we've already talked about the idea of rights to some extent. But I think it is worth coming back to the idea of rights because it is very tempting to think of rights as things which should be universal across all societies. There is the Declaration of Human Rights, which does seem to be saying that human rights are going to be the same for all societies. So it's worth thinking about kind of what do we mean by a right? We're certainly familiar with the idea. It's worth distinguishing between moral rights and legal rights. Now, that there is a debate in philosophy of law about where do legal rights come from, but it seems pretty plausible, at least, that legal rights come from people making laws. It seems pretty obvious that people make laws. And so in the United States, there's a Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights and the Constitution create the rights. And it's possible to make amendments to the laws so that they change the actual existing rights. Now, so the kind of rights that we're familiar with, things like gay rights, prisoners' rights, animal rights, smokers' rights, fetal rights, and especially important for us at this point, employee rights. And there are certainly all sorts of laws which get created that impact employee rights. So in the United States, there's things like health and safety, which help to protect employees from having to work in dangerous conditions. And there's anti-discrimination laws, which protect employees from being discriminated against on various grounds, such as race and sex and religious belief and other sorts of rights there. All right. So the Declaration of Human Rights says that all human beings have a right to own property, the right to work, the right to just and favorable remuneration, and the right to rest and leisure. A right is, just simply thinking about what a right is, either a moral right or a legal right is a justified claim on others. Exactly how it's justified is going to vary from kind of society to society, I think, but still the kind of the idea of a justification, at least in the kind of absolute view of rights, is that, you know, there's the universal rights which can be justified on a kind of very rational basis. The idea is such as that every American accused of a crime shall enjoy the right to a speedy trial by an impartial jury. And then there's like tenant rights, to do with landlords and tenants. New York City is especially strict on tenant rights. So there are moral rights kind of justified by sort of moral standards. And certainly it's worth making the distinction, which I think we've already mentioned, between negative and positive rights. We certainly talked about the idea of dignity, which is the idea that each person has their own intrinsic dignity. And so it's certainly makes it wrong to abuse people and use them against their will. And that idea, I think, is going to be especially relevant for us when we start thinking about how we treat children. I think it's plausible to say that children have an essential dignity, even though they're not rational, or at least they're not very rational. Especially young children. There are going to be gray areas when it comes to teenagers. So the basic idea is we can't just use people. When it's for our own interest, we have to respect them in some way. And so that idea, which is already familiar to us, is especially associated with Immanuel Kant. So the difference between negative rights and positive rights is that negative rights are what you can't do to somebody, the way you can't interfere with them. And then the positive rights is more to do with what you should do to interfere with them, or what you should do to help them. So things like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to defend yourself, those are all negative rights, because the idea is people shouldn't be interfering with what you're doing. Whereas welfare is a positive right. So certainly the right to get compensation is or to get help if you're on hard times. That's a positive right. And I guess something like if you think there's a right to K through 12 education, that too would be a positive right. Obviously, it costs money to pay for the education of young people. And certainly rights can conflict. There's kind of times where we can look at right to do one thing and the right to do another, and they can conflict. So an example given in our text here is what we may all agree, for example, that everyone has a right to freedom of association, as well as a right not to be discriminated against. But suppose a private club has a policy that excludes women from joining. How do we balance the right to a freedom of association against the right not to be discriminated against? So those are kind of sort of classic examples of conflicts. And then it can be tricky to know how to resolve those sorts of conflicts. So that's sort of just reminding you about the idea of rights. And now I want to be thinking about worker rights, and to what extent worker rights may vary from one place to another. So I want to look at this article here. Business ethics muted in Mexican relations. So, so this article is from 2012. It's about 10 years ago. And so it's about Walmart's operations in Mexico. And Walmart is an interesting example because it prides itself on having quite big it's big on ethics. So you can look at the Walmart ethics code. So there is there's a kind of code of conduct, and one thing it says is that they never engage in bribery. Never engage in bribery. So it says we compete fairly and honestly everywhere we do business around the world. We never attempt to gain a business advantage through bribery, and we do not tolerate corruption in any form. And so it goes on to talk about kind of its anti-bribery stance. So that's sort of interesting when then you look at there it is, yeah. They had a bribery scandal, which was so they were found that they were actually using bribery to get business when they were doing business in Mexico. So that is kind of egg on their face. But I mean, I guess we might not be too surprised to see a big multinational corporation saying one thing and doing another, right? I mean, it seems like pretty often big corporations say, "Oh yeah, of course, we don't do any bad stuff." And I think Google is famous for kind of being very high-minded and saying like it never does any bad stuff. And yet, you know, I mean, I think there's a lot of questions about Google. So I think a lot of us, if you think about places like Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, you know, we have a certain amount of skepticism about whether they really are the kind of great examples of morality that they want us to believe. So this example is about Walmart, which and it says that they face a full-blown federal investigation as prosecutors sift through nearly 10 years of real estate dealings in how the retailer managed to build 2,000 stores in a record time, while some of its competitors in the market simply gave up and went elsewhere. And Walmart says it's been investigating the matter internally for the past 6 months and will not allow illegal dealings to go unpunished. The alleged bribery scandal was about $23 million in bribes. So that's not a small amount. $24 million. All right. So and certainly there are all sorts of stories of companies doing work in Mexico, which Mexico has a reputation for having a lot of bribery going on. So Tyson Foods also violated the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in Mexico, and they agreed to pay a $4 million criminal penalty to solve a federal investigation of improper payments totaling $90,000 to Mexican officials who inspected poultry facilities in that country between 2004 and 2006. So, the big question for businesses is, you know, if you're trying to compete in a country where there's a lot of corruption, to what extent should you also engage in corruption? Because that's what everybody does. Some people say, well, that you definitely should never do it. So Stephen Zamora here in this article says, corruption breeds inefficiencies, both in the company officials having to cover up the crime and in the country's ability to set up and maintain proper protocol. And this guy is the director of the Center of US and Mexican Law at the University of Houston. Right. So, and one of the top experts in corporate ethics, Frank Vogel, says that corruption probes also inflict turmoil at the top, as the CEO and other executives are distracted from the day-to-day core business by exhaustive investigations that can last between 2 and 3 years. Right. So, at least you can make an argument that corruption is a bad idea in the long term. But I mean, it's you can also imagine it from the point of view of executives who want to make a deal. If you want to make a deal, then and if the most efficient way to do that is to give a government official, you know, $20,000, then it's very tempting to do that. So I mean, it's all very well for like people to say, like as Vogel says, the company from the CEO on down must walk the talk. It can't just be kind of part of the wallpaper. And he said, Vogel says it's a misconception that bribes are a necessary part of getting things done in some countries. Well, and that might be right, but it is kind of, I think it's a tricky thing to, I mean, you know, it's one thing to say it, it's also like this, the idea that everybody being totally kind of moral is the best way to run your company. But I mean, if you think about getting your car serviced, how many people actually trust what their mechanic says when they go and get their car serviced? I think there's this, I mean, it can be great to really trust your mechanic, but we pretty much know that a lot of car places, when you get your car serviced, they're going to give you a list of like 10 things that are wrong with your car. And, you know, are they really important things? You know, it's kind of hard to tell. There's a certain amount of, at least of bending of the truth, and that works in favor of a car mechanic. I think it's often in a company's business, if not to outright lie, to bend the truth a bit, in sort of encouraging a customer to spend money. Generally, salespeople, if you go to a store, they will tell you how great their products are. They're not going to tell you all the problems. So that's not, at least that's not telling you the full truth. So, I mean, it does seem that quite often, you know, being slightly immoral is actually pretty good for profit. So, I mean, maybe it's true that a completely immoral approach in the long run is going to be beneficial, but a lot of people aren't really interested in the long run. They're interested in making a profit like this year, because their job relies on making a profit this year, rather than like a lot of people aren't actually interested in working for a company for the next 20, 30 years. They're interested in like staying employed for the next couple of years, and they may well, if they do well, they may well move on to a different company. So in Mexico, there are anti-corruption laws, but there is a lack of enforcement with inadequate funding and education, so it does seem that there is a fair amount of bribery and corruption that goes on in Mexico. So that's the case of bribery and corruption. Now, I also want to then look at the issues to do with child labor. All right, so this article here, which is from April 2022, so this is actually pretty recent. It says in Mexico, there are more than 3 million children in conditions of child labor, representing 11.5% of the population aged 5 to 17. So, so those are pretty significant statistics. So, Undersecretary of Labor Julie Su announced the investment of $28 million to combat child and forced labor, as well as strengthening the rights of Mexican workers in the north and south of the country. So Su says that $5 million will be allocated to curb child labor, forced labor, and working conditions that are not optimal in Baja California Sur, and Chihuahua through social accountability. And also there's a $13 million project will be created to combat child labor in southern Mexico, mainly in Chiapas, Yucatan, and Quintana Roo. So there's a fairly big effort to try and avoid kind of use of child labor. So in 2019, there were about 3.3 million girls and boys who were in conditions of, so you've already seen that statistic. So there were about 1.8 million children who were working in unpermitted occupations, 1.3 who were engaged in exclusively domestic duties in unsuitable conditions, and 262,000 who were engaged in unpermitted occupation under unsuitable conditions. And in terms of numbers, about 32% were engaged in agricultural activities, 25% were engaged in construction, mining, and industry, 14% were in trade, 8% were street vendors, and 6% were doing personal services, and 6% were doing domestic work. All right, so those are pretty significant numbers, right? Now that is in Mexico, it is illegal, but it is that is not clearly not very strictly enforced. All right, so it's pretty striking that there is a lot of child labor going on. And so although it's sort of technically illegal, it's not really being enforced. So I guess one sort of thing to think about here is, should we believe in a kind of universal rights of children? Or is it reasonable for children to actually be working younger in an economy where there's a lot of much more poverty and a lot more kind of agricultural work going on than there is in the US? So if we're thinking about, I guess the question is, should we have should we endorse the idea of universal rights of children all across the world? Or should we say that no, in the United States, we definitely think that 8-year-olds should not be working in factories, should not be working on farms, and similarly with 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds. Maybe like when you can get to be 14 or 15, it's okay to do some part-time work, but we don't think you should be doing a full-time job. I guess, I mean, there's also a question in the US, certainly it's illegal in the US, but we might also wonder to what extent that's fully enforced too. I mean, it's possible that young people are actually working full-time in the US too, right? Just because we have laws against it, we might not be that different from Mexico, in that there may be some children who are in fact working full-time, but it is just going unreported. I mean, it seems, for example, that it's not that unusual if a family has a business for that family to get their kids to help out in the business. And they may be working quite long hours, even though they're pretty young. So if that happens, then I guess there's questions about what counts as employment, because they're just working in the business. But if you're going to be very strict about it, you would say no, that is not right. All right, so I think that kind of gives us some idea of how things have been sort of changing. There's another sort of useful article. Let's see. So this gives a little bit more detail to the issues. So just a few coins, mistake. I guess I apologize for my pronunciation. So it is what it is. Mistake: children from the age of 6 upwards work from dawn to dusk at chili and tomato plantations in the Coyahana municipality. I can't pronounce English words, let alone Mexican ones. A municipality of Michoacan. So they leave their homes at 5 in the morning and get back at 7 p.m., making no more than about $1 a day. They study in their spare time, otherwise their parents wouldn't allow it. They face malnutrition and neglect every single day. So they have little to celebrate for Children's Day. And children working at plantations is about, they get 1.6 Mexican dollars an hour, which is about 6% of what adults make. And farmers like it because the kids don't eat very much. They don't complain. That seems like it's a little bit, presumably they at least they complain under their breath, but they don't go up to the employer and complain. And they don't require job benefits because they're being employed illegally. So they get very little education. So their main interest is in getting money. So the schools are free, but the parents don't let their kids go to school. So you get like a place like the Center for Migrant Workers does provide healthcare services as well as food and education. But apparently the workers often don't access the services that they provide. So there's a big question in Mexico about what they should do about poverty. Certainly there are movements to try and kind of reduce the amount of child labor. And around the world, it's estimated that there are 152 million children working in child labor. So that's a lot of kids working in child labor, and about 73 million of them are working in hazardous conditions. So again, that's it's pretty major. Right. So in Mexico, about for the child labor, about 70% of them work in rural areas, and the rest of them work in the big cities. So I think that's useful information too. So that oh yeah, and then there was this article. So there's a report from the hang on. Oh, yeah, so here we go. Here's another report, which I think is gives us even more detail. So I'm not going to go through all of this because this is like a whole huge report, but it does give quite a lot of information. So yeah, you have the link, and that could be useful to you. So this report is from this year, I think. Yeah, and it's from the US government, the Department of Labor. So in 2021, it reports that Mexico made moderate advancements in efforts to eliminate the worst forms of child labor. So there are various attempts to kind of do that. So children in Mexico are subjected to, and I guess one issue we haven't talked about so far is commercial sexual exploitation, human trafficking, and illicit activities such as the production and trafficking of drugs. And then as we have talked about, there's the issues in agriculture, things like producing chili peppers, coffee, sugarcane, and tomatoes. Now, and in 2021, the Mexican government eliminated many social programs that increased educational access and reduced risk for child labor in marginalized communities. So although in some ways Mexico is actually making progress, in other ways it's going backwards. All right, so that suggests then that so when we're talking about child labor, there's the kind of stuff which is done by fairly legitimate companies, but say in agriculture, where they're so if the US imports food from Mexico, there's a reasonable chance that the food that is being imported has been kind of handled by child labor. So obviously food is legal, but the child labor is illegal. And then there's kind of stuff which like drugs, which well, it depends which drug you're talking about. Some drugs are more illegal than others these days, and some are becoming legalized. And then there's stuff which is definitely illegal, such as human trafficking. So, in some ways, I think the human trafficking example is pretty straightforward. I think we can easily say that it is a universal moral right for children not to be sexually exploited. I think that's a clear assault on their dignity as human people, and it would be kind of bizarre of us to say, well, we don't approve of that in the United States, but the moral facts change when you go to Mexico, and it's okay for them to do it there. You say, no, it's not only is it illegal for them for kids to be exploited there, but it is also immoral for them to be exploited there. So I think that gives us a good example of universal moral facts. I think it is a little less obvious that there are kind of universal moral facts about kind of children from poor families, that they shouldn't be working in farms, and that it's okay. Do we think that they should always be getting a full education rather than be kind of working in factories or working in agriculture? And I think those sorts of things are kind of more tricky to talk about. So it is useful to kind of think about the United States and the child labor in the United States. All right. So here's an article from 2017 from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is not a bureau I'm actually particularly knowledgeable about. It's not a bureau you hear a lot about. But it is worth remembering that it wasn't that long ago in the United States that child labor was actually very common. So so the article starts out with this story from Cosmopolitan. I didn't even know that Cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan is a women's magazine. I don't even know if it still exists. but it used to be quite big. And so it certainly goes back to 1906. And there was a story of an old Native American chieftain. The chieftain was given a tour of the modern city of New York. On this excursion, he saw the soaring heights of the grand skyscrapers and the majesty of the Brooklyn Bridge. He observed the comfortable masses gathered in amusement at the circus and the poor huddled in tenements. Upon completion of the chieftain's journey, several Christian men asked him, and you can just imagine, like there's a sort of implicit racism that they're going to want this Indian Native American chief to be so impressed by what New York has to offer. But he says, what's most surprising? He says, little children working. So it used to, as recently as 1906, it was actually really common for children to be working in New York. As it says, from the Industrial Revolution through the 1930s, children worked in a wide variety of occupations. If you actually look at the history of kind of work, it used to be extremely common for children to be working. Children have always worked. So in the 18th century, the arrival of a newborn to a rural family was viewed by the parents as a future beneficial laborer, an insurance company of old age. So as young as 5, a child was expected to help with farm work and other household chores. The agrarian lifestyle, common in America, required large quantities of hard work, whether it was planting crops, feeding chickens, or mending fences. Large families with less work than children would often send children to another household that would employ them as a maid, servant, or plowboy. Most families simply could not afford the costs of raising a child from birth to adulthood without some compensating labor. So it's all very well for the United States to kind of take this very sort of judgy attitude towards other countries now about how terrible it is that they employ children. But it was just about 100 years ago that the US was busy employing children. So, I mean, the US had got rid of slavery by that stage, but it was still employing children. So the whole idea that it's morally wrong to employ children is actually a fairly new idea in the Western world. So it seems like if you are going to believe in universal moral rights and say that children have rights, then not only should they not change from place to place, but they should also not change from time to time. So we should think that people back then were doing something that was morally wrong. But I think that is kind of a kind of hard thing to really maintain, because obviously in early America there was far less money, and if children were working on a farm, it seems like there was just basically no other option for them except to work as part of the family. The family couldn't afford to live without without the children participating as workers on the farm. So if it's so, do we think it's ideal that they did that? No, it seems like that's not ideal. But do we want to condemn them and say those people were just terrible people because they employed their children? Like, well, no. So it seems like we don't really want to judge the people in past America for that. We say, well, now we are in a richer society, and because we're in a richer society, we can afford for our children not to be working full time, and that's very nice for us. But that it doesn't mean that it was wrong back then for children to be working. Indeed, I mean, back then it was thought to be right for children to be working. So as it says here, industrialists viewed progress as having machines so simple to operate that a child could do it. This labor was perceived as beneficial not only to the child, but also to the public as a whole. So it was actually good for society. It was good for the child to be a productive member of society, and it was good for the whole of society to be benefiting from child labor. So here's an example of an advertisement in the Baltimore Federal Gazette, which was actively seeking children from the ages of 8 to 12 to work in a cotton mill. So one thing about one legal difference between Mexico and the US. In Mexico, it's technically illegal for children to be working, but that's not enforced. Back then, it was perfectly legal for children to be working. So the ad stated, it is hoped that those citizens having a knowledge of families, having children destitute of employment, will do an act of public benefit by directing them to the institution, the cotton mill. There was actually, there was a worry that if kids weren't employed, they were wasting their time. They should be employed. It was actually kind of very attractive for parents, apparently, to have their kids working in a mill. So, I mean, it is tempting to kind of think that although one form of relativism doesn't seem very plausible, and certainly we don't want to embrace a full-blooded relativism, it does seem that different circumstances and different societies leads to different moral views. I mean, I think it's an interesting comparison, say, with slavery or the oppression of women. I think what we would want to say about slavery and the oppression of women is that was always wrong, and that society should always have not engaged in slavery. So we can look back, say, at ancient Greek society or America back in the early 1800s or early 1900s, well, early 1800s, and say, well, their slavery and their disenfranchisement of women was wrong. But I think it's far less clear that they were doing something wrong in getting their children to work. So we might want to say, well, yeah, it's not kind of ideal, but it's kind of, it's not entirely wrong. All right, so what do we want to? How do we want to kind of think about that? How do we want to where do we want to draw the line? Because we definitely want to draw some lines. We definitely want to say that not only is slavery always wrong, but the sexual exploitation of children is always wrong. But when it comes to kind of children working, we might want to have more flexibility and say, look, rich countries can afford to not for their children not to work, and so they shouldn't have their children working. Whereas poor countries, it's not. Things are different. Now, I guess one one thing that occurs to me about this is that it's all, we can say we can't judge the past, but other people in the kind of the example of the US, it doesn't seem like, well, I mean we have to look at the issues more carefully and look at the details more carefully, but it doesn't seem so much that a lot of people were really benefiting so much from the exploitation of children in the same way that people were benefiting from the exploitation of slaves. But now, and here we are in the US in 2022, and people in the US are benefiting from the exploitation of children in other countries. So you can go to all sorts of stores and you can get both cheap produce and you can get cheap clothing, and there's a reasonable chance that one of the reasons it's cheap is that child labor was involved. So how should we feel in the United States about benefiting from child labor in that way? That seems to be an especially kind of tricky problem for us, and because it seems that now we're applying one standard for our own children, but a different standard for children in other countries. So well, once you have globalization and international trade, it seems that then you have to worry about benefiting from exploitation of children in other countries. And that makes us kind of gives us a dilemma. I mean, one option would be to say, no, we are not going to do any trade with any company in Mexico where child labor is involved in the production of their goods. A huge issue there is the problem of verification. How do you know which companies are using child labor and which are not? Because it's all off the books. It's not as if the companies are advertising those facts. So presumably then you'd have to have some inspection process to try and make sure that the company that you're using is not using any child labor. Now I mean, there's the famous case of Nike shoes, and it was exposed that they were using factories where child labor was involved, and there was a big scandal. And apparently Nike now will guarantee that the shoes that they sell in the US, there's no child labor involved. And you might still wonder, like, well, how does Nike do that? How does Nike actually guarantee that no child labor is involved? Do they have like an inspector there at all their factory, all the factories in other countries? And if they do, that'd be great, but it seems like that's tricky. So there's a whole question of how well is those sorts of things enforced. I guess that there's also the issue of consumers, like what's the attitude of consumers to that? I mean, obviously some consumers are going to feel bad about it. But yeah, I mean, you might think to yourself, like how would you feel if you bought a pair of cheap sneakers and you realized that children, like 8-year-olds had been employed at the factory making them. Would you feel bad about that? Would you feel like that was, would you feel like, would that hit you in the gut? Or would you go, oh, it's too bad, but you know, how was I to know? And so I mean, I think that there are those questions. And obviously, this is not really an issue which is getting a huge amount of publicity, right? I mean, while there are these news reports about the use of child labor in Mexico and then also in other countries, it's not exactly something which is appearing as front page news all the time. And your average consumer probably it is not aware of it very much. So so there's a question also about to what extent should consumers be actively investigating how the stuff they buy is made, right? I mean, I think we've talked a little bit about that also in the whole food business. You know, to what extent do consumers have a responsibility to inspect like the conditions of the animals that they're eating? You know, do you want to make sure that like when you go to the supermarket and buy a broiler chicken, that chicken had a happy life? Like, well, that would seem to be placing a pretty big responsibilities on consumers. So it can be kind of hard to for people in the US to know about that. And it's like, well, the US government is doing something about it. You saw those reports earlier on about the US trying to reduce the amount of child labor going on. But I mean, being realistic, it doesn't seem that that's actually going to have a massive effect on how much child labor is being used. So it seems like that's probably more like a token effort rather than a full-scale effort. Now, I mean, one option would be for companies to say, okay, well, we don't want to risk any child labor being used, so we will just not do any business with Mexico. But is that good for Mexico? It seems like, well, actually, that could hurt the workers in Mexico because then there will be less employment for them. And that would actually increase the amount of poverty in Mexico. So it might be that you can make the argument that although it's unfortunate that child labor is happening in Mexico, still US companies actually doing business with Mexican farms and factories is actually good for those people because it does actually create more employment, which otherwise they wouldn't have. So you could make an argument that is actually, while in the long run we should be aiming to try and eliminate child labor, still in the short run, it would be wrong for us to withhold our business from those companies. So it seems like the debate is actually pretty complicated, and there's lots of issues there, both in moral theory and the kind of social policy and the facts. So I think it's a kind of like a sort of troubling issue, and one that deserves a lot more scrutiny than it currently gets. Which is an issue. One of the reasons why I want you to kind of think about it more. All right, so I think that's about as much as I want to say about that issue right now, and I will kind of stop there.